Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
And before we get started, let's do our standard disclaimer because we are going to be talking a little bit about Microsoft today. So Adam, if you wouldn't mind.
It would be my pleasure. Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales. We do this show outside of work and self-fund the show. The opinions you're about to hear are those of Adam Brewer and Andy Jha and do not necessarily reflect those of Microsoft Corporation. With that, let's get on with the show.
All right. So we're going to do a quick follow-up on our Anthropic versus the U.S. government story. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Just as a refresher, the government has banned Anthropic's Claude LLM from being used. And that was because Anthropic refused to move on their terms of service, allowing mass surveillance, using their LLM for mass surveillance and autonomous weapons or weapons that are at the edge. So essentially running that LLM locally within like a missile versus like controlling it from the cloud, which is a little bit different. So on the edge itself. And so as part of that, the US government designated Anthropic as a supply chain risk, which has a lot of implications, including not allowing contractors or anyone who works with the federal government to use Anthropic's Claude LLM. And so that was a pretty big deal. And so as expected, Anthropic has officially pushed back and filed 2 federal lawsuits against the Trump administration over that designation of a supply chain risk. They allege that the Pentagon, specifically Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, illegally retaliated against them from their protected viewpoints on AI safety. They argue that the blacklist designation violates their First Amendment rights and far exceeds the actual scope of the supply chain risk laws. And so the goal of the company, or the goal of these 2 lawsuits, is that they're asking a federal judge in California to block the Pentagon officials from enforcing that blacklist, which effectively bars not only the government, but also any government suppliers from using Claude. And where Microsoft comes in is we use Claude in a lot of our things, right? In fact, I think we're coming out with a new Copilot Co-work that is getting announced. That was announced. It's a new solution that actually uses Claude on the back end. If I'm reading that correctly, if I remember that correctly.
Correct. Yep.
And so we also have Azure OpenAI, which allows the use of building AI applications using all sorts of different LLMs, Claude
including
being
Anthropic models. Yep.
one of
And
them.
then you
Yep.
can also use Anthropic models in Microsoft 365 Copilot. The researcher agent allows that. And I believe Claude is also coming to just general Microsoft 365 Copilot as well, in addition to Copilot Co-work.
Mhm.
So lots of Anthropic throughout Microsoft tooling today. And then I don't know if this is true, but I saw someone also state that Claude Code is used within software development inside of Microsoft as well. So Microsoft
sure,
also is
yeah.
a customer of Anthropic, not just partnering with, but a customer of as well. So a significant Anthropic usage and partnership throughout Microsoft.
Yeah, Claude Code for sure, like is one of, if you're a programmer or developer, that's one of the best tools out there for writing code. So, and of course, Microsoft is a major government contractor itself, right?
Mhm.
Like I work in the federal space where my main customer is the federal government. And so Microsoft has now thrown its weight behind Anthropic in a recent, this last week in a legal filing. Microsoft challenged the Pentagon's actions and stating that wielding a supply chain risk designation over a contract dispute brings severe economic consequences and sets a dangerous precedent of forcing contractors to comply with vague directions. Microsoft publicly backed Anthropic's ethical stance in stating that American AI should not be used for domestic mass surveillance or to start a war without human control. And it isn't just big tech that is pushing back. There's also a group of 22 former high-ranking military U.S. officials, including former CIA Director Michael Hayden, who has also filed briefs supporting Anthropic, and they called the Pentagon's actions a misuse of authority meant as retribution against a private company that has displeased the leadership. So a lot happening on that end, supporting Anthropic, and of course, this is going to be tied in with the courts. Hopefully, there's a stay on the execution, and there's a hold, so this will litigate it out, and it won't be disruptive to the government, to our the ongoing war that's happening, and our troops, which of course, like, Claude is actively being used in the military and part of the weapon systems that are being deployed today.
It's one of those where I hate being right, but I predicted a fair amount of this on our show 2 weeks ago, and it was pretty easy to see how this would go down. So the right answer is to prevent any major disruptions, use that ability to issue an injunction or a stay, and then litigate this through the courts as is appropriate. And then once a decision has been rendered, we can move forward. So that feels like the right thing to do. And it seems like we're headed in that direction.
And I alluded to this in our show 2 weeks ago, but there were some implications. The Anthropic was kind of seen as the quote unquote the good AI, because they were trying to have safety guards around their AI before getting deployed. They were trying to be ethical, and then OpenAI coming in and kind of swooping in and taking that and kind of basically kind of backhanding and getting the deal that had some support implications with the public. And so, because OpenAI has now signed with the military, that has really sparked a mass subscriber revolt against, known as like cancel ChatGPT or quit GPT. And so the uninstalls of ChatGPT surged by a staggering 295% following the announcement of OpenAI's decision to sign with the military. And the users kind of accused OpenAI of selling their soul and abandoning ethics. And a lot of people switched to competitors. So as a result, we talked about this, where Anthropic's Claude shot up to the number one free app on the App Store, ChatGPT dropping down. And then another thing is the backlash isn't just external. OpenAI's hardware and robotics executive, Caitlin Klanowski, resigned specifically in response to this Pentagon deal. She stated that while AI has a role in national security, the deal was rushed without proper guardrails being defined. And she specifically cited that the surveillance of Americans without judicial oversight and lethal autonomy without human authorizations are lines that deserve more deliberation than they got. So turns out she doesn't want to have killer robots with no guardrails on them, essentially.
Skynet. This is not also, I would say, not unexpected. I will say some of this is a little convenient in that there has been a bit of a pendulum shift at the moment where Anthropic's models are widely seen as maybe the gold standard today. This would maybe be more interesting if Anthropic's models were clearly seen as a distant second place or even third place in the current horse race. But this is conveniently timed with Anthropic's horse pulling ahead and coming around the most recent turn. Oh, that's I think worth noting as well, not to say any of this is motivated by one factor or another, but as I learned in my Psychology 101 class, correlation does not prove causation. And there can be multiple causes to this as well. And I think we'd be remiss in not pointing out that Anthropic is really enjoying a moment of technical superiority right now, where it's broadly seen that their models are some of the best out there right now. Also, the turmoil at OpenAI, and you point out Miss Kalinowski's resignation, we'd be remiss in not pointing out that our own employer has certainly had some turmoil internally related to Microsoft's work with the Israeli Ministry of Defense, with the United States Department of Defense, and other governmental involvement with military operations at Microsoft as well. In fact, there was a lot of internal turmoil for quite some time, especially around Israel. And it was every couple of days or every couple of weeks where you'd get an email land in your mailbox from an internal employee activist. Microsoft had multiple disruptions at conferences, the Microsoft Ignite conference, the Microsoft 50th anniversary celebration were all interrupted by protesters as well. So certainly not something that's unfamiliar or unprecedented in these times. There's, of course, people who have very strong viewpoints on the role of technology as it relates to defense and military operations, and I expect that trend to continue as well. But certainly, even companies like OpenAI are not immune from these concerns and criticism.
All right. So, on to our second story. This was super interesting. Wired put out a story by Andy Greenberg. And if you're familiar with him, he's a well known cybersecurity reporter. He's written several books, but this was a report on a US cyber weapon that we developed that actually fell into the hands of malicious actors. And a super interesting story. We'll put the link in the show notes for you. But essentially, a summary of it was Google did the release and the public announcement where they revealed that a sophisticated iPhone hacking tool, which was internally known as Karuna, was used in a series of global attacks throughout 2025. And the cybersecurity researchers strongly suspected that this tool wasn't built by foreign adversaries, but rather Truscient, the hacking and surveillance division of the U.S. military contractor L3. Truscient exclusively sells its tools to the U.S. government and the Five Eyes intelligence allies. And so it was intended for Western intelligence, but Karuna somehow wound up in the hands of the Russian government spies who used it to target Ukrainians, and then eventually made its way to Chinese cyber criminals who used it on a broad scale campaign to steal money in cryptocurrency.
I can't help but being like, aha, we told you so. We told you forever that you can invent tools and backdoors for the good guys, and somehow they will fall into the bad guys' hands. As we pointed out, with the arguments that there should be backdoors for encryption, that there should be backdoors into iOS, that we can trust that only the good guys will have access to it, and they'll be really careful about it. And here's a perfect example. And I'm using good guys and bad guys a little tongue in cheek, but you get the point. Uh, Anytime you create a tool that can be used for malicious purposes, there is always the risk of it falling into bad hands, and that has clearly, or at least seems to have happened here. So let's dig in a little further. But I couldn't help myself but be like, I told you so. We have told you so on this show forever. This is what can happen. And so here's, unfortunately, an example of that happening in the real world. And thank goodness it's not something like we have globally created a backdoor in iOS, or we have created a backdoor in Signal or something, or in encryption algorithms. At least not that we know of yet. But my
Yeah, I
goodness,
mean, this is
crazy.
something that
This is
government
wild.
agencies do all the time, right? They hoard, and the Chinese government does this, the Russian government does this, we do this. We hoard these vulnerabilities, and we've been doing it for decades, and eventually they get out, right? And so this is one of those unfortunate things. And you're exactly right, Adam. Like, this is why we shouldn't, as soon as we have a vulnerability, we should patch it, because everyone has access to that vulnerability at some point, and it'll fall into the wrong hands. And interesting enough, this was actually more of an inside job. Allegedly, it was from a U.S. contractor to foreign hackers, and it appeared to trace back to someone named Peter Williams, who was a 39-year-old Australian and former manager at Truscient. And he exploited his full access to the company's networks and resigned in 2025, sold 8 company hacking tools for $1.3 million to quote unquote Operation Zero. Operation Zero is a sanctioned Russian broker that claims to work exclusively with the Russian government and local companies. And so once Operation Zero acquired the tools, they likely sold them to the Russian government. Eventually, the toolkit was passed around and resold until it reached other countries and cybercrime syndicates. And Williams, for his part, was sentenced to 7 years in prison. And so a little bit on the technical details. Karuna was designed to hack iPhones running iOS 13 through 17.2.1, exploiting vulnerabilities known as Photon and Gallium. Apple has since patched those vulnerabilities in iOS 26. And remember, iOS naming convention switched over to the year. And previously it was like, iOS 13, 14, 15. So the last known was iOS 17. I think 18 specifically is now 26. I can't remember exactly.
You're correct. Yep, you've got it right.
So if you're running the latest iOS version, it has been patched.
And,
But
and
if you're
Apple does patch -1 systems as well. So 17 should have received a patch as well. I can verify that while you continue on.
okay. Yeah, and so essentially it uses a multi-stage exploit chain to gain remote code execution on iPhones. The payload is often delivered through malicious web content or messaging vectors. It was using the Safari web browser. There was no known exploitation of like Chrome browsers or anything else because Chrome being this was a Google report, but for sure Safari was exploited. And once inside, it could extract messages, photos, location data, and app content. And it was designed to be stealthy and leave minimal forensic traces. Researchers linked Karuna to Operation Triangulation, which was a massive 2023 campaign targeting Russian diplomats' iPhones, and it was first exposed by the cybersecurity firm Kaspersky. And while Kaspersky never explicitly accused the US of being behind the tools, they dropped a massive hint. The logo they designed for Operation Triangulation was an Apple logo made of triangles, which looked highly reminiscent of L3 Harris and the Chechen corporate logos. Another telltale sign pointing to Chechen was the internal naming conventions for the 23 tools in the kit. They heavily featured bird names like Kaswari, Terrorbird, and Bluebird, which matched the naming convention styles of previous L3 Harris tools. So, it again, patching it should remove the vulnerability, and other things that would have protected include like lockdown mode. And Adam and I have talked about lockdown mode in Apple quite a bit. And so if you are in a sensitive position, lockdown mode might not be a bad idea. And what it does is if you turn it on, because you do have to turn it on, it blocks most attachment types previews from, like if you have a message attachment like links, those previews are disabled because just rendering the preview could render like an exploit. Web browsing like JavaScript are disabled as well, unless you explicitly trust the site. Incoming calls for FaceTime are blocked unless you've contacted the person before. Like Apple service sharings are all blocked unless previously initiated. And so a bunch of things, right? Network wired connections require the device to be unlocked and explicitly approved. Auto joining insecure Wi-Fi is disabled. 2G and 3G cellular is turned off. And then configuration profiles can't be installed. So MDM enrollment is blocked. However, obviously if it's on a work phone, if you enroll the device before turning on lockdown mode, that will still work. So it keeps the status quo of any enrollment previous to turning it on. But after you turn on lockdown mode, you cannot then install another profile on the device. So a lot of things that you can do with that. And so if you are in a sensitive position, and Adam, you mentioned that recently as part of our training for security, it basically informed all of Microsoft employees that lockdown mode is something we might want to turn on.
At least if you're going into a high risk country or scenario. But in a training that's being published now to 220,000 employees and contractors.
Yeah. So yeah. So this
by
was
the way,
super
as long as
interesting.
I jumped in here,
Yeah.
iOS 18 was the last release before 26. And so it looks like, according to the Apple security release, they have actually patched iOS 15, 16, 18, and 26. So they actually did, they broadly patched against this, even farther back than they normally commit to, which is pretty wild. Also, the reason 17 is missing from that list is because 18 ran on every system that 17 did, I think. Best that I can tell. So
Yep.
Anyhow, you don't have to be on 26 to get the security release there.
Thanks for verifying that. Yeah. So super interesting. And obviously this was something that we developed and then got out and then it's being turned on us. So like you said, Adam, anytime you have these tools, you're hoarding these vulnerabilities, there's a chance, especially the human factor, right? That's usually the weakest link here. You just go on like this, that KCD comic, right? Like what's your password?
Yeah. Hit them with the hammer kind of thing.
Yeah. This was just some person who sold on the hacking tools for a couple $1 million.
Yeah. Cool. 1.3 mil.
All right. Anything else on that, Adam, before we move to our last one?
No, I think you hit on it pretty well. It is interesting now to see, I was raised an eyebrow seeing lockdown mode promoted, and the Android equivalent, which name escapes me at the moment, was also equally promoted in that Microsoft training, the security training I just went through. And the other thing that was interesting, and this is a total side note, but just to bring it up because we talked about it on the show at some point in the recent past, Microsoft actually is specifically, well, maybe I'll leave that out. I'm not sure if that's meant to be public information, but there was some specific guidance against certain vendors of network hardware and not using them anymore. I guess I'll put it that way.
We've definitely talked about that in recent shows. So take a look and see, at our previous shows and see who we recommend against here.
Yeah. I won't connect the dots, but yeah.
Okay, so our final topic today, a big one this last week here is the attack on Stryker. So this was all over the news if you haven't been paying attention just recently. I think it was just 2 days ago, where essentially we have been warning the US and CISA and all sorts of agencies have been warning against the heightened risk of retaliatory Iranian cyber operations against the United States. And while there have been some major sponsored attacks from within Iran that were temporarily hampered by internet outages, there's been a significant surge of pro-Iran hacktivist activities operating outside of those countries. And those groups have been aggressively targeting perceived adversaries, focusing on critical infrastructure and life critical sectors. And so Stryker is a massive Fortune 500 medical technology company that's headquartered in Portage, Michigan. They manufacture critical healthcare products, including surgical equipment, orthopedics, and neural technology.
If
And
you're
they
in
are
a doctor's office or a hospital, if you look around, it will not take you long to see Stryker stuff.
and they operate on a truly global scale. They employ 56,000 people across more than 75 countries, generating around $25 billion in annual revenue. And they maintain significant international hubs. And so they suffered an attack from a group called Handela that was claimed responsibility for the attack. They're pro-Palestinian, they're Iran-aligned hacktivist group that's closely linked to Iran and the Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security. They emerged around 2023. They were known for deploying custom wiper malware, which is engineered to permanently destroy and corrupt data rather than holding it for ransom. And they deliberately target life critical sectors like healthcare, energy to maximize both disruption and psychological impact. And so, that's what exactly happened to Stryker this week is, at first I think it was just on Reddit. I saw a couple of employees and start linking some Reddit posts to employees of Stryker stating that their devices have been wiped, specifically using Intune. So Stryker used Intune to manage their devices, any corporate devices, including personally enrolled devices. And so users were saying, their devices were wiped, mobile devices, computers, and everything. And all they saw was essentially a logo in the screen for Handela who said, we did this to you guys. And so Handela did claim publicly that they delivered this blow to Stryker, where they allegedly stole 50 terabytes of critical data and then wiping over 200,000 systems, servers, and mobile devices. The global outage disrupted internal services that blocked email access and forced some Stryker locations to revert entirely to pen and paper workflows. Stryker did officially confirm with the SEC by filing an 8-K, confirming that there was a severe global disruption to the company's Microsoft environment. However, interesting enough, despite Handela's claims and employee reports of wiped devices, Stryker stated they currently have no indication of ransomware or malware and believe that the incident is contained. The market reaction, the Stryker stock dropped about by 4% after the news broke, but I didn't see a whole lot of reporting afterwards. So maybe they are in a mode of like recovering. So that could be true that they have contained it and they're essentially recovering their systems. But I do know that from some of the anecdotal evidence of employees posting that they lost access to their phones and also to like their eSIMs and everything because they wiped their phones and they couldn't get anything back. So, that was pretty concerning. And then, of course, like with it being Intune, my first inclination reading the news here is that they had an admin get compromised. Now, they haven't exactly stated the vector of attack, and I haven't seen any news on the vector of attack. But my guess is somewhere, somehow, they had an admin get compromised. And so, and then, they sent a script, used a script or something like that, or sent a mass wipe in the Intune admin portal. And
It'd
so,
probably have to be some sort of script. I can't imagine the Intune admin portal allows you to just do a select all wipe, and it would have to have protections against that. But certainly you could write something that called a bunch of stuff in the Graph API and do
yeah,
that pretty easily. So I'm sure that's how this was accomplished. A really basic script. You wouldn't need much.
right. Yeah. And so, just a couple of things looking at this. And again, this is just me thinking just out of the box and like, how could I prevent this from happening? Obviously, if you are not using privileged identity management, which is a just in time activation of admin credentials, that's definitely something that you should think about, because with that, you can also scope workflows. So a lot of times you can scope it where I'm just activating it and it logs it. But you can say, I'm going to activate global admin, I'm going to activate security admin, and then Adam, who is a coworker of mine, or maybe he's my manager, has to approve that action because it's not a typical thing that I do. And so you can have a workflow approval, and you can have, actually, I think you can have multiple workflows. You could have two people approve before you activate like a sensitive role. And of course, fish resistant MFA, we've talked about that before. You should definitely have fish resistant MFA so that that can't be stolen. And then finally, there's another thing, which is multi admin approval within Intune. And so if you don't know, you can actually have the same thing, kind of like a approval workflow with PIM. You can do the same thing with Intune if there are configuration changes. So it's specifically designed in this case where an admin gets compromised and they might want to do something. Another administrative account has to approve that change before Intune applies it. So, again, kind of the same thing. So, these are couple things that you can think about and look in your environment. If you don't have those scopes, that might, help. I wouldn't say, I don't know if this would have prevented it, but just, off the top of my head, if an admin gets compromised and they just have blank access, these are a couple of ways that you can slow them down at least.
Let's also add in privileged accounts should not be federated identities. They should be cloud only accounts as well. Make it at least harder for attackers to move laterally. So if they compromise your Okta environment or heaven forbid your ADFS, then they can't also just move straight to the cloud as well. They would at least have to separately compromise those cloud admin accounts, which at this point, Andy, we did our maturity model on identity a couple months ago now, but your admin accounts should 100% be phish resistant MFA only at this point. Like pretty much no excuse. What are you doing? Buy some YubiKeys. They're not that expensive. Get it done because, I don't know. You could, again, not that it guarantees prevention against this, but it sure makes it a heck of a lot harder. And think about the millions, if not billions of dollars of impact from this cyber attack. And you can protect against that with a couple of $50 YubiKeys. Like why are we not doing that? So.
Yeah, it's really not that big of a deal. Like Microsoft, we don't issue hardware tokens, hardware keys for everyone. But the thing is that if you want one, you can get one. So it's not like issued by default, but if you want one, you can get one.
Available upon request to anyone who asks, right? But it's not just automatically, hey, what's your address? We're shipping everyone in the company one.
Yeah.
Right. So,
and I like that model, right? Like it's
perfect. If you know enough to ask about it, kind of thing, then there you go. Like, they've been saying that a lot with these reviews of the MacBook Neo recently. They're saying if you know enough to know about 8 gigs of RAM, then maybe this isn't the computer for you. But if you don't know what 8 gigs of RAM means, then it's probably fine. It's kind of been, and same thing. Like if you don't know what a YubiKey is, then you don't care if you don't have one.
And by default, everyone uses passkeys, right? And that's
device-bound passkeys, no less.
Yeah, so that's by default for every single employee, and then you can still get a YubiKey. And I use one every day, like because I use AVD and to log in, and I just have that USB, key attached to my computer and enter the pin and touch it, and then it's good to go.
Man, I'll tell you what, I try to use the device-bound passkey just because I like to see the experience for muggles, but the physical YubiKey is so much easier.
So nice.
I just go to that all the time because it works every time. It's beautiful. I love it. So yeah.
It's not only great, it's also a really nice backup. Like if I lose my phone, I still have this physical key. And if I get a new phone, I can just stick that YubiKey in to my new phone and use that as a passkey to re-authenticate back.
People have painted themselves in corners very easily now. These are the new challenges we deal with in a phish-resistant MFA world, where if I drop my phone in the toilet and it no longer works and I don't have a passkey somewhere else, it's really hard to provision a new passkey. Now, generally, my Windows PC should also have a passkey installed on it. That's default behavior now in Windows. When you Entra ID join a device, it will give you a passkey for that Entra account. But you can picture scenarios where I'm on a work trip. I only brought my phone with me. I break my phone. I need a new phone, and I don't have a way to stand it up. I mean, you can paint yourself in a corner unless you have that other way of getting to it. So that I agree. I try to have basically as many different passkeys accessible as possible. So I never run in a situation in which I have no valid way to sign in. I don't ever want to be begging for, I need my manager to validate my identity or whatever, get on a video call and hold up my ID.
Yeah, I actually had to go through that process recently because we basically wiped our entire, we have a specific network for federal employees
Right.
to converse with federal, like DoD folks.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently they wiped the entire environment and restood it up. And so we had to like revalidate everything, and we had to go through verified ID to do that, where we had to, exactly what you said, you have to like get a tap, but to do that, you have to like have a phone call with your manager and essentially have a face-to-face contact, and they have to verify you are who you say you are. Then a tap can be issued to be used to re-authenticate and then stand up your new passkeys.
Temporary access pass you're talking about.
Correct. And it's not, it's not an easy thing, because you put in the request for the call. That request to the manager only lasts for like 30 minutes or an hour. And then you get, they approve it. Your tap only lasts 30 days. And then you have to, make sure that you log in and get everything stood up. So there's a lot to do that if you, for whatever reason, lose your passkey, right? Or can't get authenticated.
Well, and if anybody's listening to this and saying, oh, that sounds like a pain, I'll stick with passwords, keep in mind we have had decades of opportunity to streamline and smooth out password-based workflows. And many of these workflows are still in their infancy for how we operate in a kind of a post-password world. So it will get better with time, but the only way you're going to learn where the rough edges are is by doing. So I don't mean to go off on a big tangent, get on a soapbox here, but certainly if you have phish-resistant MFA as the only valid sign-in method for your admins, it's a lot harder for someone to remotely compromise those accounts if they somehow have to become in possession of a phish-resistant MFA credential.
Yep. Which means having your phone or like getting a passkey,
or figuring out some way to provision one. But I mean, it's
very difficult.
You can make it very difficult. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information, along with the links to the stories that we used for our show, will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, just email us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.